Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a moment in every soul's journey when the weight we carry becomes too heavy for our own hands. A moment when strength must surrender, not in defeat, but in divine trust. Tonight, I invite you to open your hearts, quiet your spirit, and allow the gentle, mighty presence of God to move in the places where you've tried and tried and tried again. For when you finally listen, truly listen, you discover that God has already prepared the healing, the answers, and the help you've been praying for. All He asks is that you step aside, breathe, and let His power do what your worry never could. The strength of surrender opens the door for divine intervention in ways the human mind cannot fully measure. And when we talk about surrender, we are not speaking of defeat, weakness, or giving up the responsibilities that life has placed in our hands. We are speaking of a sacred act, a soulful release, a moment when a human being decides to stop wrestling with storms they were never meant to control and instead allow the presence of God to move through their circumstances with a wisdom far greater than their own. Many people move through life believing that strength is shown through constant struggle, through the refusal to sit down, through the refusal to pause, through the refusal to let go of anything. They condition themselves to measure their worth by how much weight they can carry, how many battles they can fight at one time, how long they can stand without falling. But real strength, the kind that shapes destinies and heals exhausted hearts, is not found in endless resistance, but in the courage to release the fight when the fight is no longer yours. There is a quiet bravery in stepping back and saying, God, I cannot do this alone. I have pushed myself beyond exhaustion. I have done everything I know how to do. Now I place this in your hands. That simple moment, that soft whisper from the soul, becomes the turning point where heaven leans closer, where divine wisdom begins to flow, where clarity returns after months or years of confusion. When you finally surrender, when you finally stop trying to carry the entire world on your shoulders, God performs a shift within you. The weight you carried starts to feel different, lighter, almost as if invisible hands have reached in to hold what you can no longer manage. And though everything outside of you might still look the same for a while, something deep within begins to settle. The storm loses its power, the fear loses its grip, the doubt loses its voice. Because the moment you surrender, you give God permission to step into spaces you once guarded tightly with your own limited strength. You open a door that had been locked by your pride, your independence, your desire to control the outcome of your life without allowing divine timing to play its role. You begin to understand that surrender is not an escape from responsibility, but an invitation for divine assistance that has been waiting on the other side of your resistance. We often imagine that God is far away, silent, or withholding answers, but in truth, many times it is not that God is distant. It is that we are drowning in our own noise. Our minds run from fear to fear. Our hearts jump from worry to worry, and our spirits become so tangled in the demands of life that we cannot hear the quiet instructions God has been giving us all along. Surrender quiets that noise. It brings the spirit into alignment. It creates space for the voice of God to be recognized, not as a thunderous announcement, but as a gentle direction, a nudge, a reminder, a whisper that says, my child, this burden was never yours alone. When you surrender, you not only release control, but also open yourself to receive guidance that comes without confusion, without panic, without pressure. You begin to move with divine rhythm instead of human anxiety. You take steps that feel guided instead of forced. You stop pushing doors that God never intended for you to walk through. And you start noticing the doors He quietly opens when you are finally still enough to see them. There is power in accepting that your strength has limits, but God's strength does not. There is power in recognizing that you cannot fix every relationship, heal every wound, answer every question, or carry every fear. There is freedom in admitting that you are human, beautifully human, and that the Creator who formed you never asked you to pretend to be anything else. Surrender becomes the pathway by which divine intervention makes itself known, because God steps into places where human hands cannot reach. God repairs what was broken beyond your understanding. God restores what you thought was permanently lost. God rearranges circumstances that you thought were immovable, unreachable, unchangeable. God breathes life into situations that felt barren. God brings clarity to problems that stole your peace. But all of this begins when you make the sacred choice to release the illusion of control and trust that the one who designed your life knows exactly how to navigate what you cannot. Sometimes surrender looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like taking a step back. Sometimes it looks like stopping the constant replay of fear in your mind. Sometimes it looks like admitting, I don't know what to do, but I know God does. And sometimes surrender looks like choosing not to respond, not to fight, not to prove yourself, not to force an outcome that is not aligned with what God has prepared for you. In that stillness, in that quiet pause, divine direction becomes clearer. Your spirit begins to realign with peace. Your mind becomes open to solutions that you couldn't see when you were overwhelmed. You begin to notice the subtle ways God has been protecting you, preparing you, positioning you. You begin to recognize the signs and the shifts that were invisible when your heart was consumed with stress and fear. The strength of surrender teaches you that. You do not lose anything by placing your trust in God. You gain everything. You regain the peace that fear tried to steal. You regain the clarity that confusion interrupted. You regain the hope that disappointment tried to bury. You regain the power of walking in alignment with something greater than yourself. When you surrender, you begin to witness the orchestration of divine timing, not rushed, not scattered, not chaotic, but beautifully intentional. You start to see how certain rejections were protections, how certain endings were beginnings, how certain delays were preparations. You start to feel the presence of God moving in the unseen, working in the background, shifting the atmosphere around you, even when you cannot perceive it with your physical eyes. Surrender is not something that happens once. It is a practice, a way of living, a way of trusting. Each day you choose to surrender a little more. Each day you choose to hand over the situations that drain your spirit. Each day you choose to let God steer the parts of your life that feel too heavy to navigate alone. Some days you will surrender with ease, and other days you will wrestle with letting go. But even in that struggle, God meets you with patience. He waits. He understands. He knows how tightly we cling to our plans, our expectations, our timelines. And He also knows how beautifully our lives unfold when we finally loosen that grip and allow His wisdom to lead us. The strength of surrender becomes your anchor through every storm. It becomes your quiet reminder that you are never alone, never abandoned, never without help. It becomes the light that guides you when you can't see the way forward. It becomes the peace that settles you when life feels unpredictable. And it becomes the bridge that carries you from anxiety to assurance, from fear to faith, from struggle to divine support. Listening to God means trusting more than you fear. And this truth unfolds slowly in the human heart because fear has a way of dressing itself as logic, as caution, as protection, even when it is quietly robbing you of the very peace God is trying to give you. Fear whispers in the mind long before faith has a chance to speak. And for most people, fear becomes familiar, almost comfortable, because it gives the illusion of control. When you are afraid, you watch everything closely. You guard everything tightly. You analyze every possibility, and you live in a constant state of readiness, expecting something to go wrong. But listening to God is the opposite of this constant tension. It requires a stillness within you, a willingness to lean into a voice that does not shout, a voice that does not force, a voice that moves like breath across the soul. Listening to God requires trust. Trust that the instructions he gives are not meant to harm you. Trust that the path he places before you is shaped with purpose. Trust that even when you do not understand, he already sees the outcome from where he sits, above time, above trouble, above human limitation. People often say they want to hear from God, but the truth is that many do not want to hear the part that requires them to let go of fear. Listening becomes difficult when the message challenges your comfort, when the direction points away from the familiar, when the next step is not illuminated with perfect clarity. But this is where trust begins. Trust begins in the unknown. Trust begins in the space where fear tries to rise. Trust begins when God says move and your fear says stay. Trust begins when God says be still and your fear says hurry. Trust begins when God says wait and your fear says time is running out. Trust begins when God says forgive and your fear says protect yourself. Trust is the decision to align yourself with divine wisdom rather than emotional reaction. Trust is the agreement between your soul and God that declares, what you see is greater than what I feel. What you know is greater than what I fear. That simple internal shift becomes the foundation of spiritual strength. And without it, listening becomes clouded by doubt, distorted by worry, and interrupted by unnecessary distractions. When you begin to trust God more than you fear, the way you hear him changes. His voice no longer feels distant or uncertain. It becomes clearer, gentler, more familiar, because you are no longer fighting it with your own anxiety. The human mind is noisy, filled with memories, assumptions, expectations, and unhealed experiences that shout louder than peace. But the voice of God does not compete with chaos. It waits for the quiet. It waits for the moment when you step out of your fear long enough to ask, God, what would you have me do? And when you ask with humility, with openness, with a heart ready to trust, his guidance comes softly but surely, carrying a peace that fear cannot replicate. Listening becomes a spiritual discipline, a way of navigating life with sensitivity, with awareness, with connection to something beyond your understanding. Fear tries to convince you that if you do not control everything, everything will fall apart. But trusting God teaches you that when you stop controlling everything, things begin to fall into place in ways you never imagined. When you listen to God's guidance, it does not always come as a complete map. Sometimes it comes as one small step, sometimes as a conviction in the heart, sometimes as a scripture whispered into your spirit at the exact moment you need it. Sometimes as a feeling you cannot explain, sometimes as a moment of clarity in the middle of confusion. And when you follow those small directions, they lead you to answers that fear would have kept you from ever discovering. Fear blocks the view. Trust clears it. Fear complicates the mind. Trust simplifies it. Fear shakes your foundation. Trust strengthens it. Listening to God requires that you quiet the internal storm long enough to sense the difference between fear-driven thoughts and faith-led direction. Fear leads you in circles. It repeats the same worries, replays the same scenarios, rehearses the same pain. But the voice of God moves you forward. It breaks cycles. It lifts your vision. It expands your understanding. It brings inner calm even when the outer world is chaotic. Listening becomes easier when you learn to recognize the tone of divine peace. God does not guide through panic. He does not lead through confusion. He does not speak to your spirit through the language of fear. Even his warnings come with clarity, not chaos. Even his corrections come with gentleness, not shame. The more you trust, the more you recognize his voice, and the more you recognize his voice, the more your fear begins to lose its influence over your decisions. There are moments in life when God asks you to step into something that frightens you, not because he wants to overwhelm you, but because he wants to expand you. Listening requires courage, because God often directs you toward growth, and growth rarely feels comfortable. Growth requires stretching, releasing, redefining, and moving beyond what you once believed you were capable of. When God asks you to step forward, fear asks you to step back. When God says rise, fear says hide. When God says speak, fear says stay silent. And every time you choose trust over fear, something inside you grows stronger, wiser, more aligned with purpose. Listening becomes an act of empowerment, because you are no longer guided by the tremors of insecurity, but by the steady assurance of divine instruction. There are also times when listening to God means doing nothing at all. It means waiting when you want to act. It means holding your peace when you want to defend yourself. It means staying still while God arranges what you cannot see. Fear hates waiting because fear needs movement, noise, action, results, anything to feel in control. But trust understands that waiting is not inactivity. Waiting is preparation. Waiting is protection. Waiting is alignment. Waiting is God, clearing the path that fear would have rushed you into unprepared. Listening means letting God set the pace of your life rather than letting fear push you into premature decisions that lead to unnecessary pain. Listening to God also requires honesty with yourself. Fear often hides behind pride, behind excuses, behind stories we tell ourselves to avoid obeying the direction that feels challenging. We say we are confused when deep down we are afraid. We say we are unsure when deep down we are resisting. We say we are waiting for a sign when deep down God already gave the instruction, but fear convinced us to pretend we didn't hear it. Trust removes these layers of avoidance. Trust brings honesty to the surface. Trust makes you admit, I heard you, God, and though I am afraid, I will follow. That moment of honesty becomes the doorway to breakthrough, because God can work with a willing heart even if the heart is trembling. Fear does not disqualify you from listening. Resistance does. And trust dissolves resistance by bringing your heart into agreement with God's. Well, listening is also influenced by the company you keep, the environment you stay in, and the voices you allow into your spirit. Fear is contagious, so is faith. Fear grows in environments where people magnify problems, complain constantly, discourage dreams, and speak from wounds instead of wisdom. But when you surround yourself with people who honor God, who seek peace, who walk in purpose, who speak with clarity, who choose trust over panic, your ability to listen becomes stronger. Your spirit becomes calmer. Your decisions become clearer. Listening to God becomes easier when you remove the noise that competes with His voice. Trusting God more than you fear takes time, but every small moment of trust builds a new layer of spiritual strength. The time you prayed instead of panicked. The time you waited instead of rushed. The time you forgave instead of held on to bitterness. The time you stayed silent instead of reacting. The time you stepped forward even though you were scared. These small moments become the architecture of a fearless spirit, not because fear disappears completely, but because you learn how to move even when fear is present. You learn how to hear God beneath the noise. You learn how to follow His direction even when your emotions feel unsettled. You learn how to choose faith-filled action over fear-filled paralysis. Listening to God means trusting that He knows what you do not, sees what you cannot, understands what you have not lived long enough to grasp. Means trusting that His no is still protection, His wait is still love, His go is still guidance, His not yet is still preparation. It means trusting that He is not silent because He is absent, but because He is working in ways you are not yet ready to witness. It means trusting that every divine instruction carries purpose. Even when fear tries to convince you otherwise, immediate help arrives when the heart becomes still. Because stillness is not simply the absence of movement, but the presence of awareness, the presence of peace, the presence of spiritual alignment that allows you to recognize what God has already placed around you and within you. Many people think that divine help comes with thunder, with lightning, with dramatic signs, but often God moves like a quiet breeze, gentle enough to be missed by a restless mind, powerful enough to shift an entire life. Stillness is the posture that allows you to notice the subtle ways God intervenes long before the miracle becomes visible. When the heart is noisy, when the mind is unsettled, when emotions are tangled in anxiety, fear, or frustration, divine help is not absent. It is simply unnoticed. Stillness is the opening through which clarity enters, through which direction becomes clear, through which the presence of God becomes undeniable in ways that rush and worry could never reveal. People often pray for help while their hearts remain turbulent. They pray for answers while their minds replay every worst-case scenario. They ask God for guidance while planning a backup plan rooted in fear rather than faith. They beg for doors to open while panicking about which one they should walk through. The human heart has difficulty receiving anything when it is spinning in circles. Stillness is the quieting of that spinning. It is the moment when you stop gripping every problem so tightly that you cannot feel the solution resting right beneath your fingers. It is the spiritual breath that loosens the knots inside you, and in that softening, in that unclenching, divine help can finally reach you in the way it was always meant to. There is a sacredness in stillness, because it is in those quiet places that God speaks most clearly. When you are still, your senses sharpen. You begin to feel when something is right for your spirit and when something is not. You begin to recognize the difference between your fear and God's warning, between your desires and God's timing, between your confusion and God's clarity. Stillness is not passive, it is deeply active. It is the work of listening, the work of trusting, the work of releasing. It is the choice to slow down long enough for your soul to catch up with your body. When your soul catches up, when your inner self becomes aligned and grounded, then you begin to notice how quickly divine help arrives, because it was never far away to begin with. It was only blocked by the noise of your worry. Immediate help does not always come as the solution you imagined. Sometimes it comes as calm in the middle of chaos. Sometimes it comes as strength you didn't know you had. Sometimes it comes as the right person calling you at the right moment, the right opportunity appearing without force, the right words entering your spirit when you least expect them. Sometimes immediate help is a shift inside you rather than a change around you, a shift in understanding, a shift in perception, a shift in how you carry the burden that once overwhelmed you. Stillness helps you notice when God is answering in ways your expectations could not grasp. Stillness allows the heart to remember who is truly in control. When you are frantic, everything feels urgent. Every problem feels like a disaster. Every delay feels like punishment. Every uncertainty feels like a threat. But when the heart becomes still, perspective expands. What once felt like the end becomes simply another step in the journey. What once felt impossible becomes manageable. What once frightened you reveals itself to be something God has already prepared you to handle. Stillness uncovers truth, and truth dissolves fear. In that truth, you begin to see how divine help has been surrounding you long before you asked for it, protecting you from what you did not see, guiding you away from what would have harmed you, positioning you toward what will strengthen you. When the heart is still, you stop resisting what God is trying to do in your life. Many people struggle not because God is absent, but because they are fighting against the very process designed to bless them. They want answers without surrender, change without discomfort, growth without stretching. But stillness softens that resistance. It allows you to release your grip on how you think things should unfold. It brings you into acceptance, not of defeat, but of divine order. Acceptance creates space, and in that space, help arrives effortlessly because you are no longer pushing against it. You are no longer blocking it with your anxiety, your assumptions, your impatience. You have opened yourself to receive with a quiet, trusting heart, even in moments when everything around you feels unstable. Stillness becomes your anchor. It is not the stillness of ignorance, but the stillness of spiritual certainty. The stillness that says, I do not know what will happen next, but I know I am not navigating this alone. The stillness that says, God is working even when I cannot see the evidence. The stillness that says, my spirit chooses peace even when my circumstances are noisy. And in that moment of surrender, of acceptance, of spiritual grounding, immediate help enters like light breaking into a dark room. You feel a shift inside you. You feel strength returning. You feel clarity forming. You feel yourself rising from a place that once held you down, not because the situation changed instantly, but because your inner world prepared itself to receive what God was already sending. Stillness also reveals answers that busyness keeps hidden. When you are constantly moving, constantly thinking, constantly worrying, you cannot see the solutions that are right in front of you. Your mind becomes fogged by overthinking, and your spiritual ears become muffled by noise. But when you choose stillness, even for a moment, new insights emerge. Ideas that were buried beneath stress rise to the surface, and wisdom begins to flow. You may realize that what you feared was not as powerful as you imagined. You may discover that the next step is simple once you stop complicating it. You may feel God nudging you toward a direction you resisted before. You may sense that what felt like a loss was actually a redirection. Stillness makes room for revelation, and revelation is a form of immediate divine help. Are times when God moves quickly, not because you prayed harder, but because you finally became quiet enough to recognize the path He had already cleared for you. Stillness aligns you with divine timing. You stop rushing ahead of God. You stop dragging behind Him. You find yourself walking beside the pace of grace. And when you walk beside grace, help arrives with ease. The right doors open. The wrong doors close. The right people support you. The wrong people fade away. The right opportunities appear without forcing. The wrong situations fall apart before they harm you. It feels like life is flowing rather than fighting, not because everything is perfect, but because your spirit is finally in harmony with divine movement. Immediate help arrives when the heart becomes still, because stillness is faith in action. It is the choice to believe that God is present even when emotions are overwhelming. It is the decision to trust that God is working even when your circumstances seem unchanged. It is the understanding that divine help does not need your panic to activate. It only needs your openness. Stillness is the doorway to that openness. When you stop battling the situation, you allow God to step in. When you stop rehearsing fear, you allow peace to settle. When you stop demanding answers, you allow wisdom to whisper. When you stop running, you allow guidance to catch up with you. Stillness also strengthens your spiritual identity. It reminds you that you are not defined by your struggles. It reminds you that you are not powerless. It reminds you that God has placed resilience, wisdom, and discernment within you. It reminds you that you have survived every challenge you once believed would break you. Stillness reconnects you to your own strength, a strength that fear tried to bury beneath noise. In that reconnection, you become more receptive to divine help because you are no longer approaching God from a place of panic, but from a place of trust. Trust expands your capacity to receive. Trust opens your spirit like a window to sunlight. Trust turns desperation into alignment. And in alignment, help arrives swiftly. Stillness is not something that always comes naturally. It must be practiced. There will be days when your heart wants to run and your mind wants to race. There will be moments when everything inside you feels restless and uncertain. But if you can breathe, pause, ground yourself, and say, God, quiet my spirit, you will feel the shift. It may be small at first, a softening of tension, a settling of thoughts, a momentary calm. But as you practice stillness, it becomes easier to access even in difficult moments. With each practice, you strengthen the pathway between your heart and divine peace. You begin to reach that place of inner quiet faster, deeper, more intentionally. And in that place, immediate help arrives again and again. Allowing divine power into your life begins with the willingness to release the belief that you must live by your own strength alone. So many people move through life convinced that they must carry every burden, solve every problem, fix every broken piece, and heal every wound by themselves. And this belief slowly drains the spirit, exhausts the mind, and wears down the heart. Divine power cannot enter a space that is already overcrowded with self-reliance, fear, and the need for control. It waits patiently, like a gentle presence standing at the door, knocking softly, never forcing its way in, never demanding to be noticed. God's power is not loud, not aggressive, not intrusive. It is steady, faithful, and ready the moment you decide to open the door. Allowing divine power is an act of cooperation between your spirit and the one who created it. It is not weakness, it is wisdom. It is not giving up. It is rising into a greater strength than you could ever produce on your own. When you allow divine power to move in your life, you begin to see that there are battles you were never meant to fight, burdens you were never meant to carry, and seasons you were never meant to walk through in isolation. Divine power comes not only to assist, but to transform. It reshapes your perspective, lifts your vision, restores your energy, and renews your hope. It teaches you how to navigate life in partnership with God rather than in competition with yourself. Many people unknowingly fight against divine intervention because they cling to their worries, their fears, their assumptions, and their need to understand every step before taking it. But divine power does not require understanding, it requires trust. It does not require perfection, it requires openness. It does not require that you have everything figured out, it requires that you make room for what God is ready to do. Allowing divine power means loosening your grip on the outcome. It means accepting that God's way may look different from your way. And that difference is often the blessing you didn't know you needed. Divine power moves beyond human logic. It is not restricted by time, by circumstance, by limitation, or by the mistakes of your past. Where you see obstacles, divine power sees possibilities. Where you see endings, divine power sees beginnings. Where you see delays, divine power sees preparation. When you allow that power to guide you, you stop interpreting everything through the lens of fear and begin seeing through the lens of faith. You begin to understand that every closed door has intention behind it. Every redirection has wisdom in it. Every pause has purpose breathing through it. You learn to trust that God is not only moving around you, but moving for you. Divine power enters quietly at first, like a calm settling over a troubled heart. It may come as peace in the middle of chaos, clarity in the middle of confusion, or strength in the middle of weakness. It may come as a sudden moment of understanding, a shift in perspective, a softening of your spirit, or a release of tension you've been holding for months or years. Divine power does not always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes its greatest movements are the ones that happen inside you, the unseen adjustments, the subtle healings, the quiet deliverances that reshape your inner world long before they manifest in your outer life. And the more you allow this power to work within you, the more you notice the atmosphere of your life shifting. You notice people entering your life with intention, opportunities aligning with your purpose, and situations unfolding with a timing too precise to be coincidence. Allowing divine power also means honoring the limits of your humanity. It means acknowledging that you cannot pour from a dry well, and you cannot hear divine guidance when your spirit is drowning in exhaustion. Sometimes the first step toward allowing divine power is simply resting, stepping back, quieting your mind, or giving yourself permission to breathe without guilt. God has never required you to be superhuman. He has required you to be open, to be present, to be willing. Many blessings are waiting on the other side of your willingness. Divine power flows where resistance ends. It flows into surrendered hearts, into trusting minds, into spirits that are tired of fighting alone. It flows into the spaces you finally release, into the situations you stop trying to control, and into the fears you place gently into God's hands. When you allow divine power, you begin to witness a shift in your decision-making. You no longer move from impulse or panic. You move from guidance. You move with intention. You move with clarity that rises from within. You begin to notice that your steps feel supported, as if unseen hands are directing your path. You begin to feel protected, even in situations that once intimidated you. You begin to recognize that divine power is not just something you call on in emergencies, but something you walk with every day. It becomes the foundation beneath your feet, the light that illuminates your choices, the wisdom that shapes your direction, and the reassurance that steadies your heart. Divine power also reveals who belongs in your life and who does not. When you allow God to move freely, He removes what blocks your growth, what drains your peace, and what threatens your purpose. Sometimes the loss feels painful at first, but divine power never takes without replacing. It never removes without restoring. It never ends something without preparing something greater. Allowing divine power means trusting that whatever leaves your life under God's watch was not meant to stay. It means trusting that every shift is a step toward alignment, even when the process feels uncomfortable. Growth is often uncomfortable. Change is often uncomfortable. Transformation is often uncomfortable. But divine power carries you through that discomfort with a strength that does not belong to you alone. Allowing divine power into your life also changes the way you handle adversity. Instead of crumbling under pressure, you rise with resilience. Instead of fearing the unknown, you approach it with calm expectation. Instead of reacting emotionally, you respond with wisdom. Divine power stabilizes you. It grounds you. It becomes the anchor that holds you steady when storms try to shake you. Storms no longer dictate your emotional state. Challenges no longer define your identity. Disappointment no longer steals your hope. You become someone who can walk through fire without burning, not because you are invincible, but because you are divinely supported. Divine power does not make life easier. It makes you stronger, wiser, and more capable of facing each moment with courage. When divine power is allowed to lead, you begin to experience breakthroughs that do not come from effort alone, but from alignment. Aligning with God shifts everything. It shifts your perspective, your decisions, your priorities, your relationships, your habits, your path. Alignment brings order where there was confusion, peace where there was turmoil, focus where there was distraction. You begin to see divine patterns forming in your life. You begin to feel guided rather than lost, prepared rather than overwhelmed, supported rather than abandoned. You begin to realize that what once drained you no longer holds power over you. What once frightened you no longer controls you. What once confused you no longer disrupts your peace. Divine power transforms your inner landscape until you no longer respond from survival, but from spiritual strength. Allowing divine power also brings healing, sometimes in ways you did not expect. Healing of wounds you never spoke about. Healing of memories that shaped your fears. Healing of insecurities that guided your choices. Healing of emotional heaviness that weighed on your spirit. Healing of disappointments that hardened your heart. God's power touches places that human hands cannot reach, deep, hidden, forgotten places. And as your inner world heals, your outer world begins to reflect that healing. You attract differently. You think differently. You choose differently. You walk differently. Divine power brings restoration not only to your circumstances, but to your identity. It reminds you of who you are and whose you are. It reminds you that you are not fragile, not forgotten, not forsaken. You are guided, protected, strengthened, and deeply loved. Allowing divine power is ultimately an act of surrender. A surrender not to defeat, but to alignment. It is the surrender of your fear, your control, your assumptions, your deadlines, your doubts. It is the surrender of the belief that you must always figure everything out on your own. It is the surrender that opens the floodgates of spiritual support, allowing God to move in ways that elevate your life beyond what you could create with your own hands. And the more you allow this power, the more your life becomes a reflection of grace, wisdom, strength, and peace that cannot be shaken by circumstance. You begin to live from a place of spiritual confidence, knowing that divine power is not a distant force, but a constant presence, walking with you, guiding you, lifting you, shaping you, preparing you, and unfolding blessings in ways that exceed your understanding.